Welcome to this exploration of one of the most unsettling instances in Essex County, Massachusetts history. Please let me know where you're watching from and what time you're listening to this narration in the comments section before we start. The locations and times of day or night that these recorded accounts reach are of interest to us. The Whitmore estate was a symbol of traditional New England wealth in the sleepy seaside town of Ipswich, Massachusetts, in 1892. The Whitmore family had owned the three-story, weathered clapboard siding, federal-style mansion for 3 generations. It was located on 5 acres of property with a view of the marshes where the Ipswich River meets the Atlantic. Elias Whitmore, a shipping entrepreneur whose portrait is still displayed in the town hall, had it constructed in 1803. The family's maritime empire had dwindled by 1892, but their social stature had not. What started out as a string of odd events would turn into one of the most unsettling cases in Essex County's history. The case was hidden away in courthouse archives until 1965, when a Salem State College history student unearthed a set of records that ought to have been forgotten. When the student, Margaret Atwood, discovered the Whitmore case, she recognized the name from the grand old mansion that had once overlooked the Ipswich marshes, but had long since been demolished. The records, yellowed with age and stained with what looked like water damage, had been sealed in a metal box and filed away under Unresolved Matters 1890 to 1900. The patriarch of the Whitmore family, Thaddeus Whitmore, reported his wife, Eleanor, missing to the Essex County Register on March 17, 1892. The 42-year-old Eleanor Whitmore was last seen 3 days ago when she left on a visit to her sister in nearby Rowley, according to the authorities. She never showed up. The story was only 3 paragraphs long on page 7 of the newspaper. Nobody anticipated that this disappearance would be the start of a terrifying story that would eventually engulf the Whitmore family. Eleanor was described as a woman of gentle temperament and spotless reputation in the register's account, which also noted that the good people of Ipswich were gravely concerned about her departure. It stated that no sign of the missing woman had been located, despite Sheriff Thomas Caldwell organizing a search party to explore the area between the Whitmore estate and the train station. An appeal for anyone with knowledge to come forward was made in the article's conclusion. Ipswich society held Thaddeus Whitmore in high respect, a stern-faced man of 49 with a well-groomed beard that was graying at the temples. A former ship captain who became a businessman, he was known for his cunning in managing the family's remaining investments. His wife Eleanor, their 20-year-old daughter Charlotte, and their 17-year-old son William made up his home. 3 servants were employed by the family. Sarah Jenkins, a young woman who worked as Charlotte's lady's maid and kitchen assistant. Martin Reynolds, the handyman and groundskeeper, and Mrs. Agatha Collins, the housekeeper who had been with the family for almost 15 years. From the outside, the Whitmores seemed to be the epitome of New England etiquette. Thaddeus was a substantial donor to the First Congregational Church and a member of the town council. The Ladies' Aid Society was chaired by Eleanor. William was getting ready to enroll at Harvard the next fall, and Charlotte was well known for her piano skills. Eleanor would serve her famous currant cakes at the family's frequent little parties for Ipswich's elite, and Thaddeus would talk business with other local traders. Long before Eleanor vanished, however, something had started to erode the Whitmore family's foundation beneath the pristine exterior of their federal-style home. The winter of 1891 to 1892 had been very hard, according to records in the archives of the Ipswich Historical Society. The community had been cut off for weeks due to record snowfall. Even more remote would have been the Whitmore estate, which is located at the end of a lengthy private drive off of what is now County Street. Martin Reynolds, a former groundskeeper, later informed investigators that Thaddeus had become more solitary during those winter months and frequently worked late into the night in his study, where the light could be seen from across the marshes. In his statement, Reynolds mentioned that he had seen Thaddeus wandering the grounds of the property at odd hours, either in contemplation or possibly searching for something. According to Reynolds, he would pace back and forth along the marsh's edge, occasionally pausing for extended periods of time to gaze out at the water. When I asked if he needed assistance, he would dismiss me abruptly, saying he was merely getting fresh air. The local physician's records showed the earliest indications of problems. 6 visits to the Whitmore residence had been made by Dr. James Harrison between November 1891 and February 1892. The trips were purportedly for Eleanor, who was diagnosed with female hysteria and nervous fatigue, 2 conditions that were prevalent at the time for women exhibiting signs of sadness or anxiety. Standard therapies given by Dr. Harrison included isolation, rest, and valerian tincture to promote sleep. The following margin remark, which Dr. Harrison wrote to his February 13th record, is what distinguishes these medical visits. Patient appears more fearful than ill, speaks of being watched, husband dismissive of concerns, prescribed increased dosage. In a subsequent deposition, Dr. Harrison clarified his findings. Mrs. Whitmore displayed none of the physical symptoms typically associated with hysteria. There was no fever, no unexplained pain, no fainting spells. Rather, she presented as a woman under considerable mental strain. She spoke in hushed tones and seemed reluctant to discuss her condition when her husband was present in the room. On my final visit, she grasped my arm as I was leaving and whispered, "Please, doctor, I am not imagining things. I regret now that I did not inquire further." Later, evidence from the housekeeper, Mrs. Collins, would reveal a more nuanced picture of the dynamics within the household. After the new year, Eleanor had grown more reclusive. She explained in a statement to the Essex County Sheriff's Office in April 1892. She would start at small noises, Mrs. Collins recalled hearing. More than once I found her standing at the window of her bedroom, staring out at the grounds as if expecting someone. Mrs. Collins also pointed out that Thaddeus and Eleanor's relationship had changed. They had always been reserved with one another, as is proper, but there had been a certain warmth there, small courtesies, the occasional shared smile. By January, these had disappeared entirely. Mrs. Whitmore would tense visibly when her husband entered a room, and Mr. Whitmore watched her constantly, his eyes following her movements in a way that made even me uncomfortable. Mrs. Collins said she could feel the tension between Eleanor and Thaddeus rising. Thaddeus's sudden inquiries regarding domestic affairs were the only thing that interrupted the long silences during the tense dinner conversations. According to reports, Charlotte and William were skilled at keeping up a surface dialogue to cover these awkward silences. William would talk about his Harvard preparations or Boston news from the daily newspaper, while Charlotte would share stories from her piano classes or the newest literary journal. Even murmurs seemed to have weight in the atmosphere created by the house's walls, being pressed inward by the winter's solitude. The servants said they heard arguments behind closed doors, but they couldn't make out the words. In her written statement to the sheriff's investigation, Sarah Jenkins stated that Eleanor had started locking her bedroom door at night, which was out of the ordinary for a family that had always relied on implicit confidence. Jenkins stated, "I would hear Mrs. Whitmore moving about her room late into the night. Sometimes she would pace. Other times I could hear the scratch of a pen on paper. Once I witnessed her hiding something beneath a loose floorboard under her dressing table. When she noticed me watching from the doorway, she was not angry, but seemed almost relieved. 'Sarah,' she said, 'there may come a time when someone needs to know where to look.' I did not understand her meaning then." According to reports, Eleanor Whitmore declared at breakfast on the morning of March 14, 1892, that she would be going to Rowley to see her sister, Mrs. Catherine Perkins. Thaddeus claimed that Martin had refused his offer to drive her in the family carriage, choosing instead to board the 11:30 train from Ipswich Station. She brought enough supplies for a 3-day stay in a small suitcase. Sarah Jenkins's account of that morning includes a telling detail. Mrs. Whitmore seemed unusually calm, almost resolved. She wore her dark blue traveling dress, the one with the pearl buttons, and carried her mother's cameo brooch pinned at her throat. As I helped her with her hat, she pressed a small envelope into my hand and whispered, "Give this to Charlotte if I am not back in 3 days." When I tried to question her, she simply shook her head and said, "Some things cannot be spoken aloud in this house." When she left, Thaddeus said he was in his study, deep in business communication. In the parlor, Charlotte was working on her piano skills. The young guy was being interviewed by his Harvard entrance examiner, who had come to Ipswich just to meet with William. At around 10:45 a.m., Mrs. Collins said that she had saw Eleanor go through the front door with her suitcase. She had seen Mrs. Whitmore stroll down the long drive to County Street from the kitchen window. Mrs. Collins remarked, "She never looked back at the house. That struck me as strange somehow." Thaddeus called the police 3 days after Eleanor failed to return or send word. At first, there was little cause for alarm. The most plausible explanation was that she had prolonged her stay, possibly as a result of the bad weather that had arrived on March 15th. Catherine Perkins in Rowley received a telegram. That evening she responded, turning a small home annoyance into something far more serious. Rowley had never seen Eleanor. Catherine thought the weather had delayed her sister's visit, even though she had been anticipating her. "No sign of Eleanor. Stop, have not heard from her. Stop, is something wrong? Query arriving Ipswich tomorrow morning. Stop." Catherine Perkins's later statement to Sheriff Caldwell provided more context. Eleanor had written to me the week before, saying she needed to discuss an urgent family matter in person. Her letter was vague, but conveyed a sense of disquiet. She mentioned having discovered something that changes everything. I assumed she was referring to some domestic issue, perhaps something concerning Charlotte's marriage prospects or William's education. Now, I fear it was something far more serious. Catherine's telegram, which is still in the case files. The initial stages of the investigation were standard. Deputies were sent by Sheriff Thomas Caldwell to inspect the train station. Frederick Simons, the station master, acknowledged that he had sold Mrs. Whitmore a ticket on the morning of the 14th, but he was unsure if she had actually boarded the train. There were no other travelers from that day who could recall seeing her on board. No one reported seeing Eleanor Whitmore, despite inquiries in Rowley and Newport, the next stop on the line. The following description of her was spread. A medium-height woman with auburn hair, wearing a dark blue traveling dress and carrying a brown leather valise. If not for what transpired subsequently, the case might have remained a straightforward missing persons investigation. 2 weeks after Eleanor vanished, on March 29th, Charlotte Whitmore discovered a note in her mother's sewing basket. Addressed to my dearest daughter, the letter was sent on March 13th, the day before Eleanor disappeared. Its contents, which were recorded in the sheriff's records, "My dearest Charlotte, should anything happen to me, know that I have not abandoned you willingly. For some time now, I have felt a darkness growing within these walls. Your father is not the man you believe him to be. I have discovered things, terrible things, that I cannot commit to paper. Trust no one in this house save yourself. Look to the accounts. The truth lies in the numbers. With all my love, and in haste, Mother." Instead of presenting her father this letter, Charlotte took it straight to Sheriff Caldwell. Unusual for a young woman of her station and time, this behavior raises the possibility that she had already begun to suspect her father of being involved in her mother's abduction. In her statement to the sheriff, Charlotte clarified, "In recent months, I had noticed a change in my mother. She had always been a gentle, somewhat retiring woman, content with her domestic duties and charitable work. But since Christmas she had grown watchful, almost furtive. She would fall silent when my father entered a room. More than once I found her in his study when he was away, examining his papers. When I questioned her, she would smile distantly and say, 'A wife should take an interest in her husband's affairs.' But there was something in her manner that suggested more than wifely interest." A detailed recording of the sheriff's subsequent interview with Thaddeus Whitmore is made. The letter was dismissed by Thaddeus as proof of his wife's deteriorating mental health. He mentioned Dr. Harrison's diagnosis as proof that Eleanor had been suffering from paranoid delusions for months. He asserted that the letter was more evidence of her poor health. "My wife," Thaddeus stated to Sheriff Caldwell, "had become increasingly erratic in her behavior and thinking. Dr. Harrison can confirm this. She would make odd accusations, claiming that items had been moved in her rooms, that someone had been through her personal correspondence. She even suggested that I was somehow tampering with her food, which is absurd. I indulged these fancies out of concern for her condition, hoping that with proper medical care she would improve." This letter is merely another manifestation of her disordered mind. But Sheriff Caldwell thought the timing was off. He directed a more comprehensive search of the Whitmore estate and its environs, until Deputy Frank Morris found a ripped piece of dark blue fabric trapped on a bramble close to the walkway that led from the Whitmore house to the marsh on April 3rd. This search turned up nothing. The fabric fit Eleanor's traveling dress description. Morris stated, "The fabric was caught approximately 4 feet above the ground, consistent with someone moving through the underbrush rather than along the established path. It appeared to have been torn recently. The edges were clean, not weathered, and the color matched exactly the description of Mrs. Whitmore's dress. Most telling was the presence of a pearl button still attached to the fabric, which Miss Charlotte identified as identical to those on her mother's garment. The location is significant. This area of marsh is accessible only by the private road from the Whitmore estate or by boat. Few people would have reason to venture there, especially in March." Sheriff Caldwell brought Thaddeus Whitmore in for formal interrogation because of the discovery. Thaddeus insisted on his innocence during the 7-hour interrogation. Given her worsening mental state, he hypothesized that Eleanor may have gone to the pier herself, possibly to end her life. He explained that he had been shielding his children and the family's reputation from the stigma of suicide when asked why he hadn't brought up the idea sooner. "My wife," Thaddeus said, "had become increasingly melancholic. She spoke of feeling that she had failed in some fundamental way, as a wife, as a mother. I attributed this to her nervous condition and tried to reassure her, but she seemed to sink deeper into despondency. The dock holds significance for our family. It was where we would gather in happier times to watch the ships come in. If Eleanor were contemplating a drastic action, it would be a place of meaning to her." Sheriff Caldwell asked, "And your night drive on the 14th, the same night your wife vanished, was merely coincidence?" Thaddeus's response was recorded as, "I was disturbed by my wife's departure. Something in her manner that morning had seemed final, though I couldn't articulate why. When I could not sleep, I took the carriage out, hoping that physical activity might quiet my mind. Yes, I drove toward the dock, thinking perhaps Eleanor had gone there instead of to her sister's. Finding nothing, I returned home. I did not mention this earlier because it seemed irrelevant, and frankly, because I knew how it might appear." The sheriff was unable to defend Thaddeus's detention in the absence of a body or other convincing proof. Despite his release, he was still suspected. The Whitmore family grew more and more cut off from the community in the days that followed. Social gathering invitations ceased. To avoid running into relatives, neighbors crossed the street. It was stated that the glances and whispers kept Charlotte and William at home during church sessions. On April 15th, the Weekly Ipswich Chronicle published a front-page story titled, "Mystery Deepens in Whitmore Disappearance." The article summarized the case's known facts and featured interviews with a number of locals who characterized the Whitmores as a family of standing who were now shrouded in suspicion. The article ended with a scathing reminder that, in America, a man is innocent until proven guilty, which, taken out of context, merely highlighted the pervasive conviction that Thaddeus was at fault. Sarah Jenkins later testified that the atmosphere inside the house became oppressive. Thaddeus took on a domineering role, deciding when his kids could leave the land and prohibiting them from discussing family issues with the villagers. They ate their meals quietly. The piano was unaltered. Jenkins recalled, "The house became like a tomb. Curtains were kept drawn, voices were hushed. Mr. Whitmore installed new locks on the exterior doors and kept the keys on his person at all times. He began taking his meals alone in his study, emerging only to issue instructions or to interrogate Miss Charlotte about her activities. The young lady, who had once been so vivacious, became like a ghost, moving through the rooms as if she feared making any sound." After initially supporting his father, William started to show symptoms of hesitancy. Sarah Jenkins related how she overheard a father-son quarrel during which William insisted on knowing the truth about his mother's whereabouts. Sarah reported that William left the study the next morning with reddened eyes and packed a suitcase, presumably to stay with a school friend in Boston until his Harvard semester started. But Thaddeus's response was not documented. William reportedly spoke with his sister for a long time in the garden, far from the home, before leaving. Jenkins saw them from a window upstairs. They spoke intently for nearly an hour, their heads close together. At one point, Miss Charlotte began to weep, and her brother embraced her. When they parted, Mr. William pressed something into his sister's hand, a small object I could not identify. In the meantime, Charlotte started spending a lot of time in her mother's room, sorting through her belongings. Mrs. Collins said, "She became increasingly withdrawn, often skipping meals and speaking only when directly addressed. The young lady seemed to be searching for something. According to Mrs. Collins, she would examine every book, every drawer, every seam in her mother's garments. When her father inquired about these activities, she claimed to be seeking a particular brooch she wished to wear in memory of her mother, but her search appeared far more systematic than that explanation would warrant." Charlotte brought a fresh piece of evidence to Sheriff Caldwell on April the 22nd, almost 6 weeks after Eleanor vanished. She had found a little diary concealed in the false bottom of her mother's jewelry box. The entries, which covered a number of months, showed Eleanor's developing misgivings about her husband's actions. Eleanor described odd late-night meetings that Thaddeus held, missing financial records, and overheard bits of discussions that implied he was up to no good. Her observations of his evolving conduct toward her, cold looks, tracking her correspondence, and interrogating her about chats with friends, were more unsettling. A particularly disturbing entry from February 3rd read, "T returned very late again. His coat smelled of smoke, though he claims not to have visited any establishment where smoking occurs. When questioned, he became defensive, accusing me of spying on him. Later, I discovered a letter in his coat pocket addressed to someone named Wells in Boston. The contents referred to our arrangement and maintaining absolute discretion. When I mentioned the name at breakfast, T turned quite pale." A further entry, dated February 18th. "I am now convinced that T has been systematically transferring funds from my inheritance. The bank statements he shows me are fabrications. I verified this today by visiting Mr. Patterson at First National, who showed me the actual records. Nearly half of my father's legacy is gone. When I confronted T, he denied everything, then suggested I was becoming delusional. He threatens to have Dr. Harrison commit me to Danvers Asylum if I continue to make wild accusations. I must be careful now. He knows that I know. I saw it in his eyes at dinner. I must get to Catherine tomorrow and bring her the papers. If I wait, it may be too late, was the succinct statement in the last note, which was made on March 13th. Equipped with this fresh knowledge, Sheriff Caldwell secured a warrant to conduct a more comprehensive search of Thaddeus's study. Deputies found a locked metal box with correspondence between Thaddeus and a number of business associates in Boston and New York behind a loose piece in the wainscoting. The letters described what seemed to be an investment plan that involved fake stock certificates and misrepresented assets. According to the plan, which was put together by financial specialists the sheriff's office contacted, Thaddeus established a shell corporation named Atlantic Maritime Ventures. Although this business only existed on paper, it was portrayed to investors as a successful shipping corporation with a fleet of ships that operated between Boston and the West Indies. By promising large returns on initiatives that were actually non-existent, Thaddeus had been luring investors with the respectable reputation of the Whitmore family and his standing in Ipswich society. A letter from a businessman named Harrison Wells was even more incriminating. He threatened to reveal the scam unless he was paid more. In a number of other documents, Dartmouth Shipping was mentioned as a business that Eleanor partially owned through her family's inheritance. Wells wrote, "Consider carefully what exposure would mean for a man of your standing. Not merely financial ruin, but imprisonment. What would your wife say if she knew the truth about Dartmouth Shipping?" The documents implied that, in violation of Massachusetts law, Thaddeus had been using it as security for loans without her knowledge. According to a ledger discovered among the papers, Thaddeus owed more than $50,000, which was a huge amount in 1892. The latest note, dated March 10th, revealed a last-ditch effort to obtain more money from a Boston bank by using collateral, properties that had previously been mortgaged elsewhere. Sheriff Caldwell now had a reason to act. Eleanor had exposed her husband's deceptive practices and threatened to expose him, which could have resulted in his jail and financial devastation. Thaddeus Whitmore was taken into custody on suspicion of killing his wife on April 25, 1892. In Ipswich and throughout Essex County, the arrest created a stir. On April 26th, the Boston Globe published a front-page story titled, "Prominent Ipswich Businessman Arrested in Wife's Disappearance." The piece described Thaddeus's illustrious family background and the surprise felt by many locals. The First Congregational Church's Reverend Jonathan Pembroke was cited as saying, "Mr. Whitmore has always been a pillar of our community. These accusations are difficult to reconcile with the man I have known for 20 years. However, the case remained circumstantial in the absence of a body. Throughout his incarceration, Thaddeus insisted on his innocence, and his attorney, renowned Boston lawyer Harrison Montgomery, put up much effort to refute the evidence. Montgomery proposed that Eleanor had taken the damning documents with her when she departed, after learning of her husband's financial irregularities, possibly in order to petition for divorce. In a motion submitted to the court, Montgomery argued, "The Commonwealth has produced no body, no murder weapon, and no direct evidence of foul play. They have shown that Mr. Whitmore was engaged in questionable financial practices, and that Mrs. Whitmore may have discovered these activities. But this establishes motive for Mrs. Whitmore's departure, not her murder. It is equally plausible that upon learning of her husband's deceptions, she chose to leave the marriage, taking evidence that could secure her financial independence." The breakthrough occurred on May 7th, when parts of the marshes next to the former Whitmore dock were washed away by an exceptionally powerful storm surge. Henry Marsh, a local fisherman, found partial human remains that the erosion had uncovered. According to the county medical examiner, they belonged to a woman who was about Eleanor's height and age. The finding of a gold locket with a tiny photo of Charlotte as a child among the remains was more striking because it was a piece of jewelry Eleanor was known to wear frequently. Although there was signs of blunt force trauma to the skull, the state of the remains made it impossible to determine the cause of death with certainty. Dr. Edward Simmons, the medical examiner, stated, "The remains consist of a partially decomposed torso and skull fragments. The soft tissues show signs of prolonged immersion in salt water. There is a significant fracture to the right parietal bone of the skull, consistent with a powerful blow from a blunt instrument. This injury would likely have been fatal and appears to have been inflicted ante mortem. Due to the condition of the remains, I cannot determine whether the deceased was alive when entering the water, but the skull injury suggests death occurred prior to immersion." The trial of Thaddeus Whitmore, which started on August 15, 1892, turned into one of the most dramatic court cases in Essex County's history. Reporters traveled from as far away as Boston and New York to attend the Salem courthouse, which was packed every day. The Essex County Courthouse in Salem, a massive granite structure whose very design appeared to emphasize the seriousness of the proceedings, served as the venue for the trial. The presider was a strict jurist known for his impartiality, Judge Alden Richardson. To prevent any potential bias, the jury was made up of 12 men from different sections of the county, none of whom were from Ipswich. The prosecution's case, spearheaded by District Attorney Robert Gaskell, was convincing. Thaddeus had killed Eleanor to silence her after learning of his financial crimes, then taken her body to the marsh in his carriage and weighed it down in the tidal waters, hoping the currents would carry it out to sea. Gaskell's opening statement was meticulous. "Gentlemen of the jury, this case before you is not merely about the disappearance of a respected woman. It is about the calculated destruction of a human life to protect a web of deception. The evidence will show that Thaddeus Whitmore, when faced with the collapse of his fraudulent financial empire and the prospect of public disgrace, made the coldest of calculations. Rather than face the consequences of his actions, he silenced the one person who could expose him, his own wife, Eleanor Whitmore." The defense maintained that there was still circumstantial evidence. Despite being most certainly Eleanor's, the remains displayed decomposition characteristics of a drowning victim, probably from suicide. Montgomery highlighted Eleanor's known mental health problems and said that she had committed herself because she was depressed over her husband's treachery. Montgomery's approach was to induce reasonable doubt. The prosecution asks you to convict a man of the most serious crime based on supposition and conjecture. Yes, Mr. Whitmore made grave errors in his business dealings. Yes, these actions betrayed his wife's trust, but there is a vast gulf between financial impropriety and murder. Mrs. Whitmore, upon discovering her husband's deceptions, was understandably distraught. The evidence will show that she had been experiencing profound melancholy for months. Is it not equally plausible that, overwhelmed by the collapse of her marriage and financial security, she took her own life at a place of significance to her family? The prosecution carefully developed its case over the course of the following 3 weeks. They contacted Dr. Harrison, who provided testimony regarding Eleanor's mental health in the months prior to her disappearance, highlighting the fact that she had seemed scared but not suicidal. By mid-March, they provided the financial proof that demonstrated Thaddeus's dire circumstances. Martin Reynolds was contacted and provided testimony regarding Thaddeus's drive at midnight on the night Eleanor vanished. Every point was countered by the defense. They doubted that Dr. Harrison could tell the difference between melancholy and terror. Character witnesses who attested to Thaddeus's reputation for honesty were brought in. They mentioned that Reynolds might be bitter against his boss because he had just received a reprimand from Thaddeus for failing to do his tasks. Charlotte's testimony turned out to be crucial. She talked of her father's domineering actions following her absence, and her mother's growing worry in the weeks leading up to it. When asked whether she thought her father was capable of murdering, she hesitated for a moment before responding, "I no longer know the man who raised me." Her account continued. My mother was not a fanciful woman prone to imagining threats. She was practical, level-headed. When she began to express concern about my father's activities, I initially dismissed them as marital discord, but as the winter progressed, I observed changes in both my parents. My father became secretive, often locking himself in his study for hours. My mother became watchful, collecting documents, making notes. The tension between them was palpable. In the week before she disappeared, my mother told me, "Charlotte, whatever happens, remember that I have always sought to protect you and William, even when you may not understand my actions." William's testimony did just as much harm. He disclosed that he had seen his father's boots covered in marsh mud in the utility room the morning after his mother vanished. These boots were absent when Sheriff Caldwell's deputies subsequently investigated the house. William said, "My father had always been fastidious about his footwear, insisting that muddy boots remain in the utility room rather than soiling the house. That morning, I was surprised to see his best leather boots coated with the distinctive black mud that I recognized from our excursions to the marsh. When I mentioned them, he claimed to have briefly walked the property the previous evening. 3 days later, when I sought those same boots to examine them more closely, they were nowhere to be found. When Harrison Wells, the Boston businessman whose threatening letter had been found, testified for the prosecution, it was the most dramatic moment of the trial. Wells, a stout man with a well-trimmed mustache, explained how 2 years prior, Thaddeus had come to him with an investment offer that promised extraordinary profits. Wells had eventually contributed close to $12,000 to Whitmore's scams. By January of this year, Wells stated, I had become suspicious about the lack of documented returns. When I pressed Mr. Whitmore for verification of the ships and cargo he claimed were generating profits, he became evasive. I engaged a private investigator who discovered that no vessels were registered to Atlantic Maritime Ventures. When I confronted Mr. Whitmore with this information, he first attempted to placate me with promises of imminent returns, then resorted to threats. When I insisted on withdrawing my investment, he reminded me that my wife's family had connections to the governor, and implied that any public accusations would result in countercharges that would ruin me socially. It was only when I threatened to expose his entire operation that he agreed to repay a portion of my investment. Wells also stated in his testimony that he had received an unexpected letter from Eleanor Whitmore in early March asking for a meeting. Mrs. Whitmore wrote that she had discovered discrepancies in her husband's business dealings and wished to discuss the matter confidentially. I agreed to meet her in Boston on March the 16th, but she never appeared. Catherine Perkins, Eleanor's sister, was the last witness for the prosecution. In the weeks prior to her abduction, Catherine, a dignified woman whose similarity to Eleanor was recognized by various journalists, testified about her sister's mental health. According to Catherine, Eleanor's letters had grown increasingly troubled. Her final letter, which arrived on March 12th, stated that she would be coming alone on the 14th with documents that would require immediate action. She emphasized the need for discretion, writing, "Thaddeus must not know of these discussions until matters are properly arranged." In February, she wrote asking if she and her children might visit for an extended period of time, something she had never suggested before. She also mentioned that she needed distance from Thaddeus, and mentioned legal papers she wished to discuss with my husband, who practices law. The major tenets of the defense were casting doubt on the remains' identity and offering substitute theories for Eleanor's disappearance. Montgomery summoned a medical specialist who stated that the fractured skull might have been caused by rocks in the marsh instead of an attack. He provided proof of Eleanor's growing loneliness and hinted that rather than exposing her husband, the financial records she had collected may have been part of her preparation to leave him. Montgomery's closing argument appealed to the jury's unwillingness using circumstantial proof. Gentlemen, you have been asked to send a man to his death based on supposition, inference, and conjecture. Yes, Mr. Whitmore engaged in financial improprieties. Yes, his marriage had become strained. Yes, he drove to the marsh on the night his wife disappeared. But none of these facts proves murder. The prosecution has shown you pieces of a puzzle but cannot show you the complete picture because it does not exist. I urge you to remember that in our system of justice, a man is innocent until proven guilty beyond reasonable doubt, and that standard has not been met in this case. District Attorney Gaskell's closing was equally powerful. The defendant would have you believe in a series of remarkable coincidences, that his wife discovered his fraudulent activities and then happened to disappear, that he happened to drive to the marsh on the very night she vanished, that her remains happened to be found near the Whitmore dock with injuries consistent with violent assault. Ladies and gentlemen, these are not coincidences. They are links in a chain of evidence that leads inexorably to one conclusion. Thaddeus Whitmore, facing ruin and disgrace, murdered his wife to silence her. Eleanor Whitmore deserves justice. Her children deserve truth. And society deserves protection from a man who has shown that he will stop at nothing, not even murder, to protect his interests and reputation. Following 3 days of deliberation, the jury reached a guilty verdict on September 3, 1892. Thaddeus Whitmore received a life sentence at the Charlestown, Massachusetts State Prison. He stayed still while the verdict was read, his expression emotionless. His sole statement, according to the Boston Herald, was addressed to his kids. Charlotte, William, remember me as I was, not as they claim I am. The crime itself was horrible, but so was the aftermath. Once revered across Essex County, the Whitmore name came to represent treachery and homicide. Charlotte sold the family estate for a small portion of its value and fled to Europe, supposedly settling in Switzerland, because she could no longer stand the glances and gossip. She never came back to the United States. After Charlotte left, the once grand Whitmore estate was deserted for several months. Local kids started calling it the murder house, even though their parents warned them against it. George Harrington, a Boston merchant, eventually bought it with the intention of using it as a summer home. But the Harringtons never felt at home in the house. Mrs. Harrington declined to sleep in the master bedroom where Eleanor and Thaddeus had previously lived, citing an unpleasant environment. William decided to join the Army and fight in the Spanish-American War instead of going to Harvard. He died of yellow fever in Cuba in 1898, according to records, and left no heirs. A personal effects inventory in his military records lists a small gold key on a chain, purpose unknown, as one of his belongings at the time of his passing. In the decades that followed, the Whitmore mansion had a number of owners, none of whom stayed for more than a few years. Not because of paranormal activity, no ghosts were ever reported, but rather because of the overwhelming sense of tragedy that seemed to pervade its walls. It became known as an unhappy place. In 1927, the mansion was finally dismantled to create room for a new seaside route. Thaddeus Whitmore insisted on his innocence till his death in prison in 1906. According to prison records, Thaddeus was a model prisoner who worked in the prison library before teaching basic arithmetic to illiterate inmates. He wrote in his final letter to the prison chaplain, "I have been punished not for what I did to Eleanor, but for what I failed to be for her. That is justice of a kind, I suppose." According to the warden's yearly reports, he was quiet yet helpful, and during his 14 years in prison, he had no visits. His personal belongings, which included a pocket watch, a Bible, and a miniature picture of Charlotte and William as children, were transferred to his brother Julian, who had already moved to Chicago after he passed away from pneumonia at the age of 63. If Sarah Jenkins hadn't made the discovery in 1904, the case would have remained just another tragic footnote in Essex County's history. Jenkins came forth with a shocking disclosure after leaving the Whitmore home just after the trial to work for a family in Newburyport. Charlotte Whitmore confided in her just before she left for Europe. She said in a written statement to the Essex County Prosecutor's Office. Jenkins claimed that Charlotte had acknowledged discovering her mother's whole journal, not only the passages shown at the trial. According to reports, the entire diary included entries indicating that Eleanor had been covertly communicating with a previous admirer from her youth and had been preparing to leave Thaddeus for some time. Jenkins stated that, in part, Miss Charlotte showed me entries from her mother's diary that were not presented in court. These entries spoke of Mrs. Whitmore's enduring affection for Mr. James Thornfield, whom she had known before her marriage to Mr. Whitmore. According to the diary, Mrs. Whitmore had rekindled a correspondence with Mr. Thornfield in the autumn of 1891 after learning that he had been widowed. Several entries discussed plans for Mrs. Whitmore to leave her husband and establish a new life elsewhere, possibly in Montreal, where Mr. Thornfield had business interests. Jenkins also claimed that because Charlotte thought her father was guilty and wanted him punished for his financial crimes against the family, if not for murder, she purposefully concealed this knowledge from him, along with letters she had found between her mother and this individual. "Miss Charlotte told me," Jenkins went on, "that she had found letters in a hidden compartment of her mother's writing desk. These letters from Mr. Thornfield discussed arrangements for Mrs. Whitmore to join him in Canada. One letter mentioned a property purchased in Mrs. Whitmore's maiden name and funds deposited in a Montreal bank. Miss Charlotte believed that her mother had indeed planned to abandon the family, but may have confronted her father before departing, leading to violence." When asked why she hadn't come forward sooner, Jenkins replied that Miss Charlotte made me swear on the Bible not to speak of these matters until after her father's death. She said, "He deserves punishment for what he did to our family, whether or not he killed Mother. I have kept that oath until now, but with Mr. Whitmore's passing, I feel the truth should be known." The conviction for murder was called into question by this fresh information. Could Eleanor have fabricated her abduction in order to start over, only to have a tragic accident in the marsh? Or had Thaddeus really slain her, but not out of self-preservation but out of passion? After reviewing the case, the Essex County Prosecutor's Office opted not to reopen it. Thaddeus's conviction held, and he stayed behind bars. Before historian Margaret Atwood came over Jenkins's testimony while researching her 1965 book on significant Essex County crimes, it had been tucked aside and its significance ignored. Additional contact between Charlotte Whitmore and her brother William that Atwood discovered throughout her study raised the possibility that both siblings were aware of their mother's departure preparations. In a single letter, dated October 1892, Charlotte wrote to, "I sometimes wonder if we have done right. Father is a criminal in his business dealings. Of that I have no doubt, but did he kill Mother? The more I reflect on those final weeks, the less certain I become. And yet, what difference does it make now? The verdict is rendered, and we are all serving life sentences of our own. I dreamt of Mother last night. standing by the marsh as she used to when we were children. In the dream, she asked if we had found it yet. You know what she meant, I think. Before you leave for this war, brother, should we not resolve that final question? The key you have and the box I discovered might contain the answer neither of us has been brave enough to seek. Okay, this letter, written in 1897, just before William was sent to Cuba, also alluded to a secret between them. A partial letter written by Eleanor Whitmore herself, dated March 18, 1892, 4 days after her alleged disappearance, was the most unsettling piece of evidence Atwood found. The letter, which was discovered among Charlotte's belongings after her death in Geneva in 1951, was addressed to my dearest children, and said, "By now, you must know I have gone. Please understand that this decision was not made lightly or without great pain. The life I have lived these past years has been a prison of propriety and secrets. Your father is not the man I married, and I can no longer bear witness to what he has become. I have secured means for us all to start anew, away from Ipswich, away from the Whitmore name and all it has come to represent. Charlotte, William, when you receive word from me, I pray you will find the courage to—" According to the records, neither youngster ever heard from anyone. What was Eleanor Whitmore's real fate? Did she run away and then encounter foul play, either accidentally or as a result of her husband pursuing her? Did William and Charlotte intentionally permit their father to be found guilty of a crime he might not have committed? Or was the letter a fake, written by Charlotte to ease her own psychological discomfort? After traveling to Montreal for her study, Atwood found documents pertaining to a home she had bought in February 1892 under the maiden name of Eleanor Prescott. The small home in a reputable area had never been occupied since it was sold in June 1892. The buyer was identified as James Thornfield, who, according to his company records, had never returned to Canada since leaving Montreal for Europe in April 1892. Subsequent research showed that Thornfield had, in fact, courted Eleanor when she was younger. He was a Boston merchant's son who had asked for her hand in marriage but had been rejected by her family, who preferred the more established Whitmore relationship. After that, Thornfield got married to someone else and started a prosperous import company with offices in Boston, New York, and Montreal. He was left a widower with no children after his wife passed away in September 1891. Like Eleanor herself, the truth is still hidden in the shifting sands of the marshes of Ipswich. The Whitmore case serves as evidence of how, even in the most ostensibly upright homes, underlying currents of animosity, dishonesty, and desperation may erode the foundations until they are unavoidably undermined. When a seawall was being built in 1963 close to the location of the former Whitmore Pier, workmen discovered a corroded metal box filled with wet documents. One of these was a deed to a property in Montreal, Canada, which was bought in February 1892 under Eleanor Whitmore's maiden name, Eleanor Prescott. Correspondence with a Montreal bank, which established an account with money moved from a Boston institution, was included with the deed. The box also contained a steamship ticket from Boston to Montreal on March the 16th, and a rail ticket from Ipswich to Boston dated March 14, 1892, the day Eleanor vanished. These objects implied that Eleanor had, in fact, intended to leave her husband and start over in Canada, where James Thornfield would likely follow. The most fascinating, however, was a partially written diary entry, with the ink severely faded but still readable in sections. March 14th. I leave today with mixed emotions. T suspects something. I fear last night he questioned me about the missing documents from his study, documents that would prove his guilt. I told him nothing but his eyes. I have never seen such coldness there before. If I can reach the station without incident, all will be well. I have arranged for Jay to meet me in Boston tomorrow. From there, Montreal, and then. The entry ended abruptly, as if the writer had been interrupted. Instead of just paying her sister a visit, had Eleanor been plotting an escape? Did she meet some other fate on the marshy road that March night in 1892? Or was she killed before she could carry out her plan? The last piece of the puzzle came together in 1968, when a safety deposit box that had been closed since 1892 was discovered during renovations at the former First National Bank building in Ipswich. According to the bank's records, Eleanor Whitmore had rented it in January of that year. It had original documentation demonstrating Thaddeus's deception, as well as a notebook detailing his financial wrongdoings in great detail. There was also a letter in the box, written to the Essex County District Attorney but never submitted, in which Eleanor expressed her concerns that her husband would hurt her if he found out she knew about his crimes. The letter ended by saying, "Should anything happen to me, I beg you to look beyond the marshes, beyond the facade of respectability that shrouds the Whitmore name. The truth may not lie where it seems most obvious." A little leather-bound notebook with what looked to be coded entries, columns of numbers and mysterious abbreviations, was arguably the most illuminating item in the safety deposit box. With the assistance of a cryptographer, Atwood was able to interpret the notebook, which turned out to be Eleanor's account of her own financial arrangements for her escape. It described assets moved to the Montreal Bank, investments liquidated without her husband's knowledge, and money surreptitiously taken from her personal accounts. The last entry, dated March 13, 1892, stated, "All is prepared. Tomorrow I leave this house forever. May God forgive me for abandoning my children, though I go to secure their future. When safe, I will send for them. T will not release them willingly, but the evidence I have gathered should provide sufficient leverage once I am beyond his reach. He knows. Confronted me tonight about the missing papers. Threatened. Must leave immediately. Changed plan. Marsh path to avoid the house. Signal arranged with Martin to bring carriage to dock at midnight. Pray I reach C safely. This note," which was tucked into the notebook and appeared to be written in Eleanor's hand but had a shakier script, adds a crucial change to Eleanor's escape plan that could explain her fate. She might have intended to sneak out at night along the marsh trail to the old dock, where maybe a boat waited to take her downriver to where she could board the train to Boston undetected, rather than making the public departure for the train station as announced at breakfast. Did Thaddeus find out about this scheme? On the marsh walk, did he confront her? Or did Eleanor just have a terrible mishap while trying to cross the dangerous marsh at night? In 1972, a retired Ipswich fisherman called Thomas Marsh, the son of Henry Marsh, who had found Eleanor's remains, came forward with a story that had been passed down from his father, providing the last tantalizing clue. The younger Marsh claimed that his father had discovered more than a locket and fragments of remains that day in 1892. In the silt close by, he had also found a little leather satchel that held a woman's pocketbook and papers. According to reports, Henry Marsh had concealed the bag and later looked over its contents in private out of fear of being involved in the increasingly dramatic case. Letters that implied Eleanor had been meeting in secret with James Thornfield and preparing to divorce her husband were among the documents. The two most important items were a train ticket and a sizable sum of money, which would have allowed her to flee. For what reason had Henry Marsh concealed this evidence? The elder Marsh, according to his son, had been a devout man who disapproved of a wife leaving her spouse, no matter what the reason. For a loan that had saved his fishing boat years before, he had also owed money to Thaddeus Whitmore. He had concealed information that could have changed the outcome of the trial, whether out of moral conviction or misguided loyalty. On his deathbed in 1922, Thomas Marsh said his father had revealed the secret and apologized for keeping it to himself. A secret, literally taken to the grave, the satchel and its contents were reportedly interred in the Marsh family burial in the old cemetery. Today, just a worn stone wall and the twisted remnants of a once formal garden commemorate the location of the Whitmore mansion. The ancient pier is only visible in old photos, and nature has long since reclaimed the Marsh Road. Nevertheless, the Whitmore's tale of upholding appearances at great expense, secrets that linger behind closed doors, and justice that is both served and not carried out still has resonance today. Ultimately, the most terrifying part of the Whitmore case is not what it shows about that specific family, but rather what it implies about the possible evil that might exist in any home, beneath any honorable exterior. The all-too-human propensity for deceit, treachery, and the desperate actions made when meticulously planned lives start to fall apart are what frighten people, not the paranormal. The sound of the Whitmore story continues to reverberate today, carried on the salt-laden winds that sweep across the Ipswich marshes, a whispered warning about the fragility of appearances and the weight of unspoken truths. As the Essex County Archives write in their entry on the case, the Whitmore tragedy serves as a reminder that history's most disturbing chapters are often written not in moments of chaos, but in the quiet desperation of ordinary lives pushed beyond endurance. Secrets that have never been fully disclosed or completely forgotten continue to float in the chilly waters where the Ipswich River meets the Atlantic. Locals claim that on especially quiet evenings, the Marsh Trail occasionally appears to have the tiniest trace of footsteps, a lone figure moving toward the freedom she would never achieve.